Welcome back. Okay, so next element in our unit on non-financial reporting. Now we talk about the big topics and methods. First I start with some broad topics. And so what you see here is really a key list of bullet points, but I also want to convince you that actually this is a relatively decent structure on how we can think about non-financial reporting work. At least for me. Okay, so let's start with the most important thing first. So that's measurement. So we are accountants. Accountants know how to measure things. This is what sets us apart from other researchers that work, let's say, in this area. So when I say accountants know how to measure things, then this does not imply that we are the natural born experts in assessing the greenhouse gas emissions of a firm. Of course we're not. But what we do in terms of our research, we try to understand how a certain measure, first of all, can be, let's say, transformed into other dimensions, so in other units. So for example, we work on the topic on how, let's say, a certain greenhouse gas emission and that is been measured in CO2 equivalent metric tons can be reconciled, for example, to become a monetary value. Okay, so this is the stuff where we come in, right? And also we focus on the question of how these measures actually interact with human behavior. So how do they affect human behavior? How does human behavior actually change the measurement and the transformation process of this measure? And all these things are extremely important in this area, right? So when it comes to the question of where can we as accountants contribute, personally, I believe this is where. Okay, so we as a group of researchers and academics, we should be able to help the community here in sustainability reporting to develop a measurement system that, first of all, works, that is comparable across firms and time, and B, that is, let's say, gaming proof towards incentives of the participating agents, right? And that actually fulfills its information role. Okay? So this is really a key area of where accounting work can maybe help and inform the debate. And of course, building on this, there are other areas which I think are, let's say, combined, but they all anchor around this idea of measurement. So the first, of course, is once we develop measures, we start to manage, right? You manage what you measure, a truism from the management accounting, let's say, field. And of course, certainly true when it comes to non-financial reporting. So as soon as we start to develop a key understanding of what the measures are, we can start to theorize and then empirically test of how these measures and the existence of these measures will interact with managerial behavior. So, and of course, this is also interesting because in the core of all this is a problem that is, I think, very paramount for firms, that it's also been debated in the management literature throughout. And this is related to the question, well, how do you manage a firm if you have multiple objectives? So in the past, we have been it was relatively easy for us to describe management approaches because we could actually anchor the problem on a single measure that a manager strives to optimize. For example, when you think about the old Friedman type of shareholder value, you could say, okay, in the end, it's about maximizing shareholder value, a risky measure, and then you can think about how to manage all the firm in order to reach its objective. So now, as we know, this is most likely no longer, let's say, a correct description of how the world works. Instead, what we see now is that firms face multiple objectives. There's this terminology of shareholder value versus shareholder welfare, and shareholder welfare incorporates, additional measures than just, let's say, the present value of future cash flows. And all this then relates to the challenge and the key challenge to actually manage a firm under multiple objectives. So, and this is, of course, a fascinating area, which I think also accountants again can contribute to, because our understanding on how measures affect managerial processes is profound, right? So this is where management comes into play. Then, of course, also closely related to this, as soon as a firm is facing the question on whether to disclose these measures to outsiders, from outsiders, we are in the classical disclosure problem. So what is the incentive for disclosure? Is this an unraveling story? Is this a cheap talk story? Is this maybe a signaling problem, or could this be something else like legitimacy, right? So these questions of why and whether firms will actually disclose this new type of information is something that we can, of course, study then. Maybe a little bit different from the traditional financial field. The next big question that people ask is, well, is this type of disclosure actually having real effects, A, on the firm behavior itself, and B, on the behavior of other stakeholders? So when you think about the firm itself, so think about, a firm now being forced maybe to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. Maybe the manager of the firm will actually take action in order to reduce the greenhouse gas emission to be more on a level with her competitors, maybe, right? So, and then, of course, these real effects, they also can happen not at the level of the firm, but also on the level of the other stakeholders. So obvious questions are, well, do these other stakeholders, for example, consumers, change their attitude towards a certain firm once the firm discloses sustainability related information? So, and does this maybe even change the willingness to pay of consumers, or the incentive or extensive margin, basically consumption? So all these questions are interesting and related, right? So when you think about all this, then what becomes, I hope, relatively obvious is that we are facing a highly interconnected setting. So I try to visualize this a little bit here with this wonderful graph with a lot of arrows that point into different directions. So, and the first thing, as an econometrician, you see, this is unfortunate, because this is cyclic, right? So it's not an acyclic graph. You see that there are circles, many circles, matter of factly, in this graph, and this basically is one thing that can be understood as a key problem when it comes to identification. So since all these things interact with each other, it is not that easy to actually have causal tests in this thing. You will see this in the next video when I talk about the current evidence that we have, right? So you see, for example, when you start, let's say in the lower right and the upper left corner, so you have firms and their stakeholders. So stakeholders here are, of course, not just investors, but for example, also employees, consumers, and maybe also suppliers and so on, right? And the government maybe. Yeah, well, the government is also regulated, so let's not get too complicated here. So firms and stakeholders, they interact on markets, right? And both stakeholders and firms participate in these markets. And let's say, from an economic, maybe this is an economist viewpoint here, but in the markets are where the sausage is being made, right? So think about employees and firms, right? They interact on the labor market, and both of them obviously have asymmetric information. So the employees, they know their state, and the firms, they know their state, and then the question of sustainability reporting becomes a question of whether firms actually report relevant information to the labor market, and they do, right? So as soon as they start to report certain disclosures, then the employees, they can use these disclosures, and you can think about this as a matching problem where employees search for a certain employer that has a certain, let's say, approach to sustainability, and this information can actually help the matching of stakeholders and firms. So in this case, employers and firms. So this is perfect. At the same time, it's also complicated, right? So as a firm, you have an interest in, let's say, highly skilled employees, and you want to make sure that you get a good match of employees. So maybe you have an incentive to greenwash a little bit in your disclosure so that you look nice for employees that you believe have a certain interest in a certain type of sustainability behavior. So, you see that only looking at this one problem here, you also you already indicate a little bit of attention here. So now the regulators come into play. So the regulators are basically our third party now. The regulators actually want to they want to achieve a certain, let's say, economic outcome. So you can think about regulators as being highly incentivized, opportunistic agents, but you can also think about regulators for a second as being let's say, the benevolent regulator that just tries to do things right and optimize social welfare here in this whole system. So now the regulator actually also has certain goals and objectives when it comes to sustainability. So climate change is obviously, you know, one of the biggest topics currently, or if not the biggest topic. So regulators will have an agenda here. So they need information from firms in order to reach this objective. So they need disclosure. So it's extremely important to them. And then they can regulate. So here, regulate, I was tempted to break up regulation in 3 different types of regulation. I decided against it, not to clutter this picture. But I want you to think about this regulation arrow that runs from regulators to firms as an arrow that comes in 3 different flavors, at least. Because you can think about regulation of transparency, so you can regulate the actual disclosure rules. You can regulate the price of, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, right? And you can regulate the quantity, right? So the quantity will be, you could disallow maybe firms to exceed certain levels of emissions, or maybe you could even disallow all types of emissions altogether. So you can disallow a certain technology. So all this is regulation. So the regulators actually have a relatively rich menu on what they can do, and they need to use this menu in order to reach their overall political objectives. So let's say if the EU, the European Union, has a certain emission target for 2035, they have to think about, well, how can we reach this target? And maybe the easiest way to reach this target would be to regulate quantity. But then if you regulate quantity, basically you rob firms of a little bit of the opportunity to innovate, right? So maybe you want to regulate price instead, or maybe you want to regulate transparency with the hope that then the stakeholders will motivate firms actually to behave into a certain way. Okay, and you see also when it comes to the markets, as a regulator, you have another angle. You can actually regulate these markets with the hope that they work efficiently in order to get the incentives of the stakeholder to the firms. Now, all this is complicated because as a politician, of course, you need to get elected by stakeholders. So this is also now the last arrow that I think that I didn't talk about. So you see that in this complex structure, so you have to move, let's say, you have to act. And as a regulator, for example, if you want to make sure that all this is, let's say, reaching some sort of social optimal state, then you really have to think about, you know, your regulation options, and it is becoming quite complicated, especially if you also buy into our market participants being more behavioral than strictly rational. So now you have also to think about, well, how do I actually motivate consumers to take climate change more seriously? So ideally you would have consumers to be very climate change aware, maybe, as a regulator, because then they would exceed power on firms and maybe speed up the motivation of firms to actually invest into climate friendly technologies. But then again, stakeholders, maybe they like their sneakers because they're sneakers and not because they have a certain carbon footprint. So now you have to maybe think about, well, how can I make the climate related aspects of a product more salient with consumers? And then you start to think about nudging and all these things. Yeah, life is complicated. Yeah. So all this is, I think, fascinating from a researcher's perspective, right? But at the same time, also really political pressing. So, and this means that whatever happens in this field currently is that people have high stakes and people have really high expectations, and yeah, it is a very passionate and very heated field currently. And this also leads to a little bit of an issue that I would like to talk about when it comes to methods. So I think this is at the same time frightening and fascinating what we currently see. So what is fascinating? So obviously non-financial reporting is a part of this overall debate on sustainability and climate change, of this whole large field. And this large field is, of course, attracting, and also rightly so, the interest from researchers across all wide fields. So here I just tried to come up with a list, but we could make this list even larger if we want. But it clearly ranges from the normal natural sciences. so chemistry, physics, geophysics, all these areas, then over to engineering. And engineering actually takes a large role in this, because engineering is really where, let's say, at least when it comes to the ecological impact, where the actual, let's say, decisions are being made. And then, every field that is related to social behavior and social interaction actually becomes involved. So sociology, of course, political science, I could also mention psychology. And then within our area, so that we have people from the more managerial fields, so management scholars, as well as economists. And all this, interacts. And rightly so, because this is such a broad topic, so that I think we need the expertise from all these fields actually to make a contribution and to help to understand this better, right? So this does not only speak to different fields and different, let's say, domain knowledge, but also to different paradigms. So throughout this course, the paradigm that we mostly used was clearly economics based, right? So starting with the theory over to the empirical studies that we've looked into, we always had this a little bit of a baseline understanding that that social behavior can be described with the paradigm and theory world of economics. This does not mean that we always assume that people are rational in terms of rational maximizing behavior. But of course, people can have behavioral limitations, and people maybe react or act for reasons that are hard to observe. But at the same time, we always had this idea that we start from the individual behavior and we start to predict the individual behavior, and then we look at market outcomes, and then we actually predict, let's say, overall outcomes. So this is typical for economic-based work. But here in this field, obviously, other paradigms are at play as well. So when you think about sociological arguments, then these sociological arguments often don't start at the individual, but start at groups and societies, and they talk less about utility, individual utility, but more about group power, group pressure. And this is a different way of understanding how social interaction works, and this is fascinating and also extremely helpful, because obviously all these paradigms then have no a priori right to be right? So it's also almost a futile discussion to think about right or wrong here, but it's just about coming up with predictions on how to understand social interaction and behavior. And of course, these different angles can be helpful by focusing on different mechanisms that maybe are empirically supported, right? So this is perfect. So at the same time, this is also costly. And I think what we have to understand is, if many researchers from different fields interact, we have to understand that we have to be opening up and broadening for these other insights, and this requires a little bit of investment from ourselves, but basically from everybody who's involved. So, and I think there are two aspects here maybe that I would like to stress a little bit. So let me start with the second one here in this bullet point list. If you want to talk to researchers in other fields and other domains from other paradigms, you have to tune down your jargon and your theorization. Because as an economist, it's so easy to talk about, well, here you have a signaling equilibrium, blah, 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 with a separating part and a pooling part. So this is, for an economist, this is very precise and good language, and we directly understand what is going on. But for a sociologist, this sounds alien, right? This sounds like something like, what, right? So, and you cannot and you should not expect that sociologists will do micro 101 courses in order to understand what we're talking about. Also, like sociologists cannot understand that we read Foucault back and forth in order to understand what they are talking about. So that means that we really have to adopt a language and adopt a way to communicate that we help other fields, other paradigms to understand what we're actually saying. So this at times also requires us to put a little bit less emphasis on developing fancy theoretical models or even fancy econometric methods for estimation, but instead try to keep things simple and clear and to the point and let the data speak. So and another aspect of this is actually sometimes it can be even better to let the data not just speak, but also to provide the data. Because if, let's say an economist is doing a survey study and is surveying people and asking people about preferences and beliefs, maybe with the objective to assess willingness to pay or something, then this survey data in itself could be interesting to a sociologist, but from a very different angle. So, the data would be looked at from a different angle, and that can be enlightening and insightful. But this requires us not only to share our fancy papers, but also maybe the underlying data. So I think this is where collaboration really shines, because the opportunity to reuse data, also to reuse code and methods, is really, really rich. At the same time, it is clearly an area where we need to think about, writing simple, writing to the point, explaining our stuff well to a, let's say, academic, but from our field perspective, layman audience, right? Really important. So then the next thing is, when paradigms and field overlap on a certain topic, then there's always this risk, let's say, that a certain field thinks about the other field as being, let's say, to some extent, aggressively entering their area. So this has also been labeled as methodological imperialism, and the idea is, let's assume you're an economist and you think about here something, a clear question: should we regulate price or quantity? It's a core econ question. And all of a sudden a sociologist steps in and tells you something about group power and how this is, something that is not a question about optimizing the regulation, but more about fighting in lobby groups and for the biggest stake that you actually get from the cake. So you as an economist might maybe think, well, what are you doing in my topic here? So, but of course you shouldn't be thinking that way. But at the same time, you should also be aware that the other side might think this way, and to be very accommodating to these, to these feelings, right? So it really is a question where, we only can benefit from each other if we allow everybody to, share their views, not with an, like, I'm right and you're wrong approach, this is completely stupid, but more with an idea of, hey, here's how I see this. Maybe this can help you to, in your view, to adjust, let's say, how you interpret your findings, right? So, and then if we can do this together, I think then we have a lot to offer, because obviously the competitive advantages of different fields and methods vary according to the exact research question that you have in mind, right? So for example, if you understand political decision making, then maybe, just maybe, it's not the right idea to just think about an economic equilibrium analysis with an optimal outcome and then to say, okay, and this is what politicians implement, right? So this is not how the political process can be described well, because this is a small, let's say, small scale, small n social interaction problem, where of course the individual will become very influential, and the, let's say, social and behavioral attributes of this individual will become very influential. So this is an area where I think the general econ assumptions don't really travel well. On the other hand, if you think about financial markets are characterized by large N and relatively abstract transactions, where it's easy to, let's say, abstract away from the individual preferences and just let the money speak. And here is an area where I think, economists have a relatively clear understanding how interaction works, and where maybe the idea of group power and so on might be a little bit less straightforward. Okay, so this is what I wanted to talk about when it comes to the methods. You see, the key takeaway from this last minutes is, well, work on sustainability is interdisciplinary, and let's make sure that we take the best out of it. Yeah, not by methodological imperialism trying to trump out the others, but by actually listening and speaking so that the other can understand. Yeah. That's it. So that was this video. Now we're going to move on to, let's say, the existing evidence in the third video. They are going to be relatively brief, and I have a lot of, many question marks for you. So, perfect. Thanks for watching, and see you in a bit. Cheers, bye.